I was up there in Holly Gulch, but there's about 220,000 gajillion people up there. So I came back to my campsite, and it's just as beautiful here as it is anywhere else. It's quieter too. So I'm going to continue on my discussion on the Egyptian literatures with you right here from camp. This is some of the view that we've got here in the High Sea foothills. Beautiful spot. The Egyptian literature is an interesting corpus of writings. The Egyptologists used to think that it was all about the dead. Now they're changing their tune. Now they're saying the Egyptian literature is all about the living, and it's for use in their temples. So I want to talk about that with you a little bit. I'm going to pull up a chair here and share some information from the Egyptologist John Gee. See if I can get this camera right. I'm trying to show you the beautiful foothills behind me. It's a beautiful spot. In the proceedings of the 9th International Congress of Egyptologists for 2007, this was just a brief couple of years ago, Gee did an article on the Egyptian texts being divinely written, being inspired. Now this brings in the question, is this literature scripture? And the answer is yes, by every designation that we can find from the Egyptians themselves. Now the modern Egyptologists, of course, there are some who don't accept that, but what Gee does is he goes into the Egyptian literature to see what they describe their own writings as, and in every sense, it's scripture. So this kind of gives us pause for judging the ancient literatures from our modern viewpoints of canon and apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, so on and so forth. We have to be careful in putting our modern conceptions onto the ancient literatures. But that, unfortunately, that's what we happen to be doing, and that doesn't work. That doesn't match. In another article that Dr. Gee has written in the Totenbuchforschungen, this is for 2006, he discusses the use of the daily temple liturgy in the Book of the Dead. And it's fascinating how he has explored numerous various Egyptologists and their analysis of the Egyptian literature, showing that several dozen chapters in the Egyptian Book of the Dead are not about the dead, but they were used by the living initiates in the temples. So I'm going to explore these two topics with you and share some ideas, some just brand new. This is 2006, this was 2007, on the Egyptological understanding of the information. John Gee has brought it up to date up to this point. It is extremely fascinating that some modern Egyptologists say that we need to use the reductionist approach to the Egyptian literature. And reductionism, as T. Velde has shown, he defines this term reductionism as the scholars who explain something away into something else, or who reduces religious phenomenon. And the idea is to not allow the ancient Egyptian texts to tell us what they mean, but to reduce all of their interesting information on their religion down to natural phenomenon. That's reductionism. And in point of fact, reductionism is like Hamlet with Hamlet left out. We don't think these particular religious thoughts like the ancient Egyptians, therefore we're not going to allow them to have their own version of ancient religion. That's reductionism. And it's imposing our will on the ancient texts, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't give us what the ancient Egyptians believed. So that's one of the interesting things that John Gee says, is he says, for the purposes of determining whether a document was considered by the ancient Egyptians as divinely written, then what we do is we look in the ancient Egyptian literature and see if they described any of their text as being divinely written. I mean, it's so logical. It's so obvious. In other words, we take the ancient Egyptians seriously with what they say. This is something modern Egyptologists simply won't do. They say, well, We don't believe that way, therefore they couldn't have. And even though they say they did, we're not going to allow them that. Well, quite frankly, what's that going to get you? You know, it's not going to get us any understanding of the ancient Egyptians at all in that respect. So, on page 808, one text that Guy notes that was understood to be divinely written is Coffin Text 131. Now, the rubric to Coffin Text 131 informs us that it is for sealing a decree upon a family. It's for sealing a family to a man for eternity, giving the family of a man to him in the God's domain, in the eternal domain. Although this rubric might apply to the whole series of texts, which comprise Coffin Texts, spells number 131 through 135. That's kind of interesting there. So it may be to a whole group of texts. Horus, the great and eldest, Lord of the field of reeds, Geb, the crown prince of the gods, his commanded to give to me my family, my children, my brothers, my father, my mother, my loved ones, and all of my neighbors. Here the text explicitly identifies even though it is based on the royal decrees, Guy notes, he says, Geb, who has a complete Horus name himself also, he gives the command. So this text clearly depicts Geb as the author. Now, Geb is one of the gods. So the idea of a divinely authored text, absolutely. Coffin Text 131 is one of those, without question. We also have known oracular decrees from the New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate Period. These contain an epilogue in which the deity himself is represented as declaring that whatsoever promises have been included will be fulfilled. So we have actual texts who depict the gods themselves giving the decrees, and those decrees is what is written in the texts. And that's called a divine authorship as far as Guy can understand, and as far as any of us can understand. But the modern Egyptologists say, no, that's not what we want to believe about the ancient Egyptians. Therefore, we will reduce their religion to natural phenomenon. It's absurd is what it is. See, the bias of modern Egyptologists, this is one lesson in, well, and when you get to the Joseph Smith Papyri, and of course the Book of Abraham, which has associations with Joseph Smith Papyri, do you think they're going to give any of that a chance? Not at all. Their bias completely disqualifies them from making any type of objective assessment of the scriptures, whether ancient Egyptian or the LDS scriptures, as far as we know. So, they are thought to be divinely inspired written texts, the ancient Egyptian materials. At the end of the Ptolemaic period comes a document called the Book of Breathings made by Isis. Notice this, the goddess makes these Book of Breathings. And the current name for the document is one translation, and probably a mistranslation of the ancient title. It proclaims in its very title that it was made by Isis. So we can see that Isis is understood to be the author. Again, a god authoring, a goddess in a sense. The full version of the title is quite clear. This is called the beginning of the letter of fellowship made by Isis for her brother Osiris to make his soul live, to make his body live, to rejuvenate all of his limbs so that he may join in the horizon like his father Re, with his father Re also, cause his soul to appear in heaven as the disk of the moon, and on and on and on. Well, later in the document, the individual is told, Thoth, the twice great, the Lord of Hermopolis, has come to you specifically so that you may write this letter of fellowship, or the Book of Breathing. So see, not only has the Book of the Dead been mistranslated, it's not about the dead at all. It's called the Book of the Going Forth by Day. That's the proper translation of the Egyptian literature in the Book of the Dead. But now we find that the Book of Breathings is also a mistranslation. The proper translation of the Book of Breathings is the letter of fellowship between the gods or with the gods. Now this is seriously significant. Is any of the Egyptian literature funerary, in other words? Now questions are coming around. What on earth is going on here? There's a reassessment going on that's very important to recognize.